The most widely published book in human history reveals that we are created in the image of God. Throughout our human journey, each encounter is an opportunity to see the shared humanity in ourselves and others. Regardless of one's views on religion, each experience and each story weaves us together towards a common path of transformation, a process of growth and understanding, a recognition that, at our core, we share a common destiny. What does the search for truth really mean in our lives? How can we find a sense of unity in a world so diverse and divided? As we reflect on these questions, we start to uncover a fundamental connection that binds us all beyond our differences. Welcome to Created in the Image of God, Building Vibrant Communities, with our host, Wade Franson. Today's episode is Faith Beyond Dogma.
Welcome to Created in the Image of God. I'm your host, Wade Franson. We're pre-recording today, and it's episode 194 with Addison Hart, who hails from Norway right now, but he is not a Norwegian, which is good because since I'm Swedish, otherwise there would be some tension there. But he may have Norwegian in his background. We're about to find out. Welcome to the studio, Addison.
Glad to be here, Wade.
Well, I've really been looking forward to this because I've been, reading up on you a little bit, following your journey, seeing how the world has reacted to some of your views, pro and con. You've made a stir, you've made an impact over the course of your life. And what I love about you is your dedication. So let's introduce you to the audience by having you share your creation story. Where were you born? Who were your parents? What was the environment you grew up in as God began to mold and shape you through your circumstances and through your experiences before you took conscious thought? So just open up about that, if you would.
Well, it's kind of hard to speak consciously about what I was doing before I was conscious, but
well, what was the young Addison like from your recollections and pictures and stories?
Yeah, very inquisitive young man, always curious about everything, and certainly about God. That was my mother, when she was still alive, would tell how some of my first questions was, the usual childish questions, who is God and who made God, and those kinds of things that but always a fascination with the big picture, if you will. And pardon me, I'm trying to get a dog from, biting my hand here to get my attention. But I grew up in Maryland from an old family. And, so I'm basically Scottish and English background is my ethnicity and all that, and my family was there in Maryland from the 17th century on, so it's very rooted and very, in a sense, almost Anglo-centric, because we grew up eating kidneys, and as far as we were concerned, culture was on the other side of the Atlantic from Maryland, and that was pretty much Britain for us. So that was actually my upbringing. So very snobbish and, not upper class really, I guess background wise, maybe, but middle class. And over the course of the years, I've lived in many places. Once I was ordained, I was first ordained in the Episcopal Church in the United States, the Anglican Church in the United States. And after some years, became very dissatisfied and became a Roman Catholic priest for some years. And over the course of my life, I've lived in many places in the U.S. So for some time in New Mexico, for example, I was living very close to the Navajo reservation. And in my parish, we had Navajo and Hispanic and everybody else was considered Anglo. It didn't matter, what color your skin was, or we had one lady who came from India and she was Anglo as far as they were concerned, because Native Americans, that's basically the three categories in that area.
Allow me to go back half a step. And what was it that led you to pursue the priesthood, and what were the circumstances of that?
Well, I guess sometime in my teens, briefly, because I didn't stay in it for long, the charismatic movement, when I was about 17 or so, brought me back into sort of a living relationship with Christ, to put it in those terms. Very soon after that, I came back to my Anglo-Catholicism, very high church Anglicanism, which when I became Roman Catholic, I remember telling my fellow Roman Catholics that I had to become more Protestant to become a Roman Catholic, which actually was kind of true at that point. But very, very high church, and became very close to a convent, an Anglo-Catholic convent in Maryland, to the sisters there, and learned a great deal from them, and learned a great deal basically about the contemplative life, and almost became a monk at one point. I was thinking very seriously about the monastic life, and even explored that a bit. And so I can't really say why I felt drawn to the priesthood, but I did, and I went to seminary. I first went to Harvard Divinity School, and then after that to Ambridge, Pennsylvania, to an Episcopal seminary that was there, and was ordained in 1988 into the Episcopal Church, and was there for a while. And like I say, all through that time, I had a great draw towards the Eastern Christian, the Orthodox Christian mindset and spirituality and theology. And so that was always a pull on me.
I'm trying to remember the exact date. It was either 88 or 89 when I was ordained in the Black Forest in Germany, but my path was, within something more akin to Protestantism, or, the evangelical or charismatic movement, maybe. But the main difference in this next question is married, right? So celibacy, I assume, was your path, and what was that a hard decision for you?
No, I didn't have to become celibate to be an Episcopal priest, and the Roman Catholic Church will take married priests who are Anglicans and also Lutherans and others, and will go ahead and ordain them.
Interesting.
So
Interesting. I would see, again, I mentioned in the sort of intro talk my pockets of ignorance, and I've just shared evidence of one, right? So how did that distinguish you from other Catholic priests? And I'm kind of shocked that I was ignorant of that. How does that work, practically speaking?
Well, I mean, there's different rules in the sense that a married Catholic priest doesn't get to become the pastor of the church, but he's a priest in every sense other than that. And I was a university chaplain, so that gave me an awful lot of interaction with young people, students, and I even taught university level courses and things like that.
Well, this is fascinating because, again, as a minister, and in my somewhat younger judgmental years, I would ask myself, how can these priests really understand the sheep, right? Jesus said we should, be aware of and sensitive to the needs of the sheep. And my thought there was, without an understanding of married life and the challenges, it's a two-edged sword.
Well, you meet all kinds, and I've known I still don't know very fine celibate Catholic priests who I would say are quite capable of counseling married people, and it's not really an issue. And then there's others that I wouldn't consider very good at it, but I don't want to get into too much of it.
Probably on both sides, right? People are people, regardless of those other circumstances.
In the Orthodox Church, it's never been the case that celibate priesthood was insisted upon. In the Orthodox Church, in fact, quite the opposite. You can't really run a parish unless you're married. And that's just based on the biblical injunction that if a person can't run a household, what's he doing running the parish, basically? And we find that in the pastoral epistles.
Right. Okay, so you're now a Catholic.
No, I'm not. Orthodox.
No, no,
I'm
no,
not.
no, no. I mean, in our story,
I mean, in the
in our
story,
story, our hero is now a Catholic in our story.
how I got to be a hero, I'll never know. But no, yes, and this was out up near Chicago in a place called DeKalb rather, and I was there at the Newman Center. It's called. That's the very. I mean, I think we had like 5,000 families. It's in Chicago area. Catholicism is huge numbers wise, and I think second only maybe to Los Angeles County or something like that. But and maybe even larger than that, than Los Angeles. I don't know. But it's huge. And so when you talk about your typical Catholic parish near the Chicago area, you're usually talking about not thousands of people, but thousands of families belonging to a single parish. And we had that. And then in addition to that, a very large ministry to Catholic college students. And it was a global ministry because they come from all over the world to study in Chicago. And so we were, so we had people from everywhere were there. And it was Northern Illinois University. It was the university I was doing ministry in. So anyway, I married a Norwegian. So that's how I ended up coming over to Norway. So here I am over here. And
when did that move take place? And were you still a Catholic at that time?
Yes and no. Technically, yes. Not a priest, obviously, at that point, because I retired. I felt that it's one thing. It's one thing to be trying to be a priest over in the United States, but I went through a kind of a messy divorce situation, and that's part of my background. And then because I simply don't believe priests should be divorced and remarried. That's not a popular view with many, but it is what I think, at least for me, morally, that's a decision I had to make. Do I remarry? The answer is yes. How do I live in that context? Well,
and the Norwegian wife is the one that you now have, I would assume.
Right.
Not the one from whom you're divorced.
No. And that was a very difficult time in my life to go through that, and not to dwell on that, but
but I did dwell on that in my own situation. This is my second book.
Yeah.
And it is the opening up of exactly that. I was in the ministry. I was married. My audience knows, I think I might have shared with you, I was kidnapped in a domestic kidnapping as a child. My mother was given custody. My father smuggled us out of the country. It went to the Supreme Court of Sweden eventually. So there's an interesting parallel here.
Yeah, I'm right. Because I listened to one of those episodes where you were talking to somebody else, and I remember you talking about that.
But my coming to grips, and I call it the demon that possessed me, was I will never get divorced, right? Mm-hmm. This was so huge in my life that I would not do what my father did. And of course, never say never. My wife divorced me, but it was out of my control. But I had to really wrestle with what was my part in this. What did I do or not do or could have done? Going deep into scripture, going way back to Genesis, the role of the man and woman, studying what does this mean? Husband is the head of the wife, and all this, and unpacking it over the course of this book. And Jesus' statement, Moses allowed divorce because of the hardness of your hearts, but from the beginning it was not so. This isn't about me. Let me just say I'm empathizing and with utmost respect at your decision to say, you know what? And not to put words in your mouth, but this disqualifies me from being a priest. I like whatever or however you would word it. I respect what you're getting at here, and so please do unpack that. Not going into any gory details, but
well, in my situation, it had to do with without, I don't want to go into too much detail, but it was a borderline personality disorder situation. Someone who really should not be in relationship because it creates, and it even friendships, And frankly, it was either that or I end up mentally ill. So so I made that decision and decided that this was, and with a psychiatric advice and actually with the Roman Catholic Church saying yes, you should go ahead and do that. So they actually were supportive, which was surprising because I wasn't expecting that. But I say now, I'm not, there's kind of a way that the Orthodox teach about, living like brother and sister and things like that, which make married life easier in a second marriage, which then you're not violating your conscience in any way. You're living as mutually supportive companions, but at the same time, I don't want to be a divorced and remarried person being a priest. Somehow, to me, that just isn't that isn't the best way to go about these things. So,
two things, unpopular to hear, but there is the very direct statement: God hates divorce, right?
Yeah.
And the other part of this is, let me ask a personal question. You don't have to answer this. I don't mean to pressure you, but there was a reason you were attracted to that woman and chose to marry her. I mean, was there some reflection there about how and why you ended up in that situation with somebody in that condition?
Well, actually, I was an older person, so was she. So it was more a matter of we're very good friends, and I love her dearly, and I could easily be a companion. She's an iconographer, painter of religious art. I write. It's a very quiet household, semi-monastic, if you will. And
no, I mean the first marriage. The attraction.
Yeah. Well, you see, if you're talking about borderline, it's not seen very obviously in early years. So you may get a few I got a few red lights, red flags, whatever you want to call them, and then it peaks somewhere in the 50s, and then it stays pretty much plateaus. And there are different levels. You can live with somebody like that if it's a milder case. Obviously, if it's a severe case, then you're dealing with a situation where it becomes psychologically difficult to survive it, and so that's where you have to say, okay, do we live in two separate households? And the psychiatrist says, no, you actually have got, and if you want to get through this, you're going to have a complete separation, and it's for their sake every bit as much as it is for your sake. And so that's the decision. So yes, God hates divorce, and so do I, and so does anybody who is sensible. But there are just some situations that
it's why Moses allowed it.
Yeah, there are just some situations where if you don't do it, everyone's going to suffer worse, and that was this situation. Yeah.
Well, I think this is a good sort of segue point to go to a quick commercial break, which I'm not sure if we have a video about you or something else, but when we come back, we'll talk about your life's work and your passion for service to God, service to your fellow man, and again this continuing journey of what led you to eventually leave the Catholic Church and move over to the Orthodox Church. So for the audience, don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with more of Addison Hart.
Discover the world's religious traditions like never before with Ocean 2.0 Reader. Our custom ebook reader is designed for exploration and study with an immersive audio integrated reading experience and powerful research tools available on all platforms including web, Windows, macOS, Linux, Android, and iOS. Experience the benefits of immersive reading by combining ear and eye with improved comprehension and vocabulary acquisition. Our interfaith library features books from various religions, so you can have access to a wealth of knowledge. Try Ocean 2.0 Reader today and elevate your reading experience.
Welcome back to Created in the Image of God. We're here with Addison Hart, tuning in from Norway. When we last left Addison, we talked about the various changes in his life and, how he's, moving through those things. What is sort of the guiding light? How do you know, at what point to turn left or turn right, or, to go from this position to some new position, in this case, the Catholic Church to the Orthodox Church? How do those inspirations come from? How does the Holy Spirit work with you?
Well, I think if we're going to talk about orthodoxy, ultimately, then I'd have to say, like I did. I mean, the one kind of spiritual, and I hate to use the word spirituality because it's kind of an airy-fairy word that you really have a hard time pinning down, but piety or your whole belief system, your prayer life, your ascetical life, all of these things are the Orthodox Church is very demanding in these areas. But everything in me has been gravitating to that for 40 years. So when I pray, it was always with, the Jesus prayer. My whole theological bent has always been towards the Eastern fathers, the Greek fathers and the Syriac fathers, much more than the Latin fathers, although I have great love for many of them as well. And so the gravity, if you want to put it that way, was always pulling me in that direction, and so that was a constant, regardless of being an Anglican or a Roman Catholic. The reason I became Catholic instead of Orthodox was because Anglicanism was a daughter church of Western Catholicism. And so it seemed to me that if I'm going to leave the Anglo-Catholic Church, then I should at least give the Western Church some priority. It's kind of the default church to go to if you're brought up in an Anglican context and you leave it. And I don't want to talk too much about what there was in Episcopalianism that didn't suit me, but I can honestly say that it being a mixture of kind of, there's a low church, a high church, a progressive side and a conservative side. There was no real center there. Catholicism has that, and so that appealed to me. But once I was in there, I was there for 12 years, and the first thing, of course, that I ran into almost immediately was that within the first 5 or 6 years, the priest scandal broke. Okay. And that kind of, it took a lot of steam out of me regarding the church and just how many problems there actually were in it. But I also found that just in so many ways, because the Roman Catholic Church is basically a church of law, and I don't mean that in the Protestant sense. I just mean they really are invested heavily in canon law, very kind of picayune, hair-splitting sort of legal processes, which are the ways that, a good example would be annulment. They don't have divorce, so they come up with a way to get around calling it a divorce, and through very sophisticated legal rhetoric, they are able to annul a marriage, but not divorce the couple. And then then you're allowed to remarry, see, after you have an annulment. So you still have
Right.
divorce remarriage.
Right.
And it's those kinds of things. Plus some of the I never could actually, I tried to believe it. This is the thing, you go into this and you say, okay, well, I will believe it simply because they teach it, and now I will make myself believe it. And things like papal infallibility and supremacy, which are very, very late doctrines, and things like that. And And I finally just had to say, you know what, I just don't buy this. I thought I did. I thought I could go down this route, that it was simply an alternative to, say, Orthodox belief, but that deep in my heart, I'm actually Orthodox, and I have been for all these years.
Well, allow me to ask a question and then invite you to unpack that a little bit more, because again, pockets of ignorance that I have on my side. And so we used to teach in the famous christening of Simon with the name Peter, that what Jesus was actually saying was, you are Peter, which means a little stone, right? In other words, kind of, you're a chip off the old block, is kind of how I would put it in colloquial terms. And on this rock, myself, Christ being the rock, I will build my church. I never really investigated that in Greek. I'm not a Greek scholar. I speak multiple languages, but not Greek. And, so I studied more into Hebrew than Greek. But is that true? Is that fair? Is that what that verse is saying, that Jesus said, you are a part of the foundation, and on this rock, on myself, I will build my church? Or is it really saying, I will build my church on you, Peter?
Well, first, it's a very complicated question that you just asked.
I know.
The first question is, where does Jesus say this to Peter? And it's a place called Caesarea Philippi. Okay. Right. And in that region, the belief was there really was, in a sense, a gateway to the underworld, the gates of hell. And you have to get into this whole understanding of how.
Right, because the gates of hell will not prevail against it. This is actually well depicted in the series The Chosen, and this is why this is on the top of mind. We just watched season 4, episode whatever of The Chosen, in which that scene is depicted.
Well, you see, he's where he says it is actually quite important. So he's, literally, he's on a rock, and it's where, quote unquote, the gates of hell are. Right. So. It's more complicated than I can get into, but I can say that what the first thing we want to say is what gospel is this taking place in? Well, it's in Matthew's gospel.
Yes, exactly.
Matthew probably is writing for the Antiochian church in Syria. Okay, that church was believed to be one of the original, what's called one of the Petrine sees, meaning there were 3 in the ancient world which were regarded as being connected to Peter. One was obviously Rome. One is Antioch. In fact, that's the first one. The other is Alexandria in Egypt. Okay. And those 3 were the 3 major cities. They're all part of the Roman Empire. So in a sense, it's all Rome. But there's no connection to the city of Rome. There's absolutely nothing in that verse where Jesus is saying, you're Peter, and upon all your successors who happen to be bishops in Rome, I will build my church. There's nothing there that even remotely suggests that. So what's he talking about? Probably it's not just that Christ is the rock, although you can make that the case, but upon this rock probably means, like Origen, an early church writer, said, probably means the confession of faith, which, by the way, was celebrated.
Right, because that's also, isn't that where it's recorded that Jesus recognized, that Peter recognized who Jesus was, that this is where he said, who do men say I am? Who do you say I am? And this was given to you. That's that same.
Right. And you are the
passage, right?
Right. You're the Christ, you're the Son of the living God. And
right.
And it says, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, upon this rock I will build my church. Okay. And if nothing else, at least means the confession that he's the one who, by the way, the gates of hell will not prevail against me. The thing always to remember is gates never attack anybody.
Right.
You attack the gates. and that then gets into the whole Easter proclamation that Christ defeats death, kicks down the gates of hell, and frees those who are imprisoned, if you will, by death itself. So that's So all of that's what's more or less happening, and more. Like I say, it's a complicated passage. But the one thing you can be sure of, it is not a substantiation of the current Roman papacy. It just isn't, and that's
Right.
not to say that we haven't seen great popes in recent years and all of that. It's not to knock. It's just that that's not what the passage is referring to. Despite all the effort to make it mean that, it just doesn't. So.
Yeah, the word of God is faithful and true. It's our interpretations that get us into trouble.
Yeah. So, but the Orthodox Church, I mean, here's the thing. You can say, okay, well, we have churches that make claims. All right. In order to be a Catholic, you have to accept the Roman claims. That in order to be a Protestant, depending on what kind of Protestantism we're talking about, Anglicanism, for example, is very good at this. We make claims about our authenticity, about that we're part of the thing about Orthodoxy is it doesn't have to make any claims. It just is the same church that you find in the new. It's the church that basically produced the New Testament. And there's an unbroken heritage. It goes right back, and you can't find a time when the Orthodox become Orthodox. They were always the church that they still are. So
here's a question out of left field. And again, thank you for humoring me on my own curiosity. I hope it's of interest to the audience. But the Great Schism, right, and the deadly wound, I believe there are interpretations out there that could possibly be referring to the split between the Eastern and Western Church. Is that your view at all? Have you ever explored that?
Yeah. No, the Great Schism. No, the Great Schism is dated to the year 1054. Okay, and that's when you have a cardinal who is sent to Constantinople, which was a very important city. It's the city of the emperor. And for a lot of reasons, which aren't worth getting into, at some point, this cardinal goes up to the altar where the Patriarch of Constantinople is celebrating the liturgy, and he lays a papal bull on the altar, which excommunicates the Patriarch of Constantinople. And at that point, in the year 1054, it's simply an argument between Constantinople and Rome. Most people don't even realize that there's any split going on. So as far as the rest of the Catholic/Orthodox world is concerned, the church is still one. And
history identifies that, but at the time it went unnoticed, which is not unusual.
And it continued to be unnoticed for 600 years by different peoples in different places. It just became wider and wider. There were a whole series of things that eventually made it so that schism was hard to bridge. And one of them, of course, were the papal claims. By the 1300s, actually the 13th century, you already have the popes making claims that for any soul to be saved, it had to be submitted to the Bishop of Rome. And, so you get all these claims, and of course, over in places like Constantinople and Antioch, who are now, by the way, having problems with the encroachments of Islam,
right,
and other things, it's very hard for them to even understand how those claims can be made, because for them, this is just so far from left field, to use baseball analogy. You can tell I'm an American, that after a while, it's just simply recognized we really are not two churches, even speaking the same theological language anymore. They are and they aren't. So there's plenty of crossover and mutual respect, and also the schism is pretty much a schism. So I don't know if that answers the question.
No, it certainly gives me the history. Hasn't directly answered if your view is that's what those verses are referring to about the deadly wound. That's one interpretation I've heard. I'm just curious what you're taking.
Well, what verse? What verse?
It's in the, and I'm pulling it out of memory, so I don't have it right in front of me. But it's talking about, I think it's the book of Revelation, and it talks about the deadly wound that was healed.
Are you talking about that one of the 10 horns on the seven
Yes.
head? Okay, that has nothing to do with Roman Catholicism or anything. What that has to do is with Nero Caesar and a legend that was understood at that period. Book of Revelation basically has nothing to do with the future, except for the parts where Jesus comes back. but you have to understand it in its own context, and that context is basically, as Irenaeus of Lyon, one of the very early church fathers, he's only 2 generations from the Apostle John. He says, "Oh well, when John wrote this, he's referring to he's referring to the reign of Diocletian, you see, and this is a reference to Nero having returned. So we know all the way from the church fathers what that was all about. It's just that since then, the Book of Revelation has become sort of an obsession,
Right.
especially in Protestantism.
Well, and again, that's the world I come from, which is why I'm asking the question. Okay,
Right.
so we can move on then. We're sort of at the end of this second segment, and I've taken us down several rabbit holes. So what I want to maybe understand before we go to a quick commercial break is, so what was the transition like for you? Becoming now, well, so did the divorce, happen sort of at the same time? So you became Orthodox, but not a priest in the Orthodox?
Well, no, I held on in the Catholic Church for a while after that, and
Yeah.
became Orthodox much more recently. So, but
Okay.
yeah.
And did that coincide with the moving to Norway?
Yeah, I didn't make the step until I was in Norway, and now I belong to a parish in Bergen, and a very lively parish. It's a growing parish, and our median age is 25 or 26.
Well, as a Swede, having lived in Sweden, I was always aware that the Norwegians were tended to be more open to faith and religion than the secular Swedes who declared themselves to be the humanitarian superpower in the late 60s and early 70s as they continued to move away from religion.
Yeah.
But okay, so when we come back, I really want to talk about your books and sort of those activities and what you're doing now. It's obviously there's so much here to unpack. I'd probably have to have you back if you're willing to get deeper into some of this information. But don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with more of Addison Hart.
In a world where faith takes root and blossoms, comes a journey of growth like no other. Blooming for Christ, a captivating exploration of spirituality and the remarkable parallels between a plant's journey and our own. Just as a seed must germinate to become a thriving plant, our spiritual timeline begins with a single decision. Through the insightful words of Reverend Barbara Brian, this book takes you on a transformative quest. A journey of growth that echoes the stages of a plant's life. From the tender shoot of a young believer bravely facing the world, to the full bloom of faith experiences shared and cherished. As seeds of faith are sown, new believers are nurtured, and the cycle continues just as God intended. But the journey doesn't end there. As the plant matures, so does the believer, becoming God's chosen harvester in gardens of divine purpose. Reverend Brian's guidance, rooted in scripture and wisdom, gently leads you through the seasons of your spiritual life. Join us on this journey of discovery and renewal, a journey that unveils the beauty of your faith and the transformative power of God's love. Blooming for Christ. Embrace your season of growth and let your faith bloom. Available now.
Welcome back. We've been discussing Addison Hart's journey from Maryland to Norway, from an initial, let's call it a flirting with more charismatic, and before getting into back into the high church, and then, orthodoxy, and just been fascinated to help fill in a few of the pockets of my ignorance about the early church fathers on the East and West and how they view various topics. But now what we want to talk about is, Addison, you as an author. You've got 12 books. The most recent book is Four Gospels, One Heart, One Lord. One of the reasons I invited you to the show was a book
actually, it's called Four Gospels, Four Hearts, One Lord.
Thank you. Four Gospels, Four Hearts, One Lord. Let me correct my note.
Yeah.
And what sort of attracted me and said, we got to have this guy on, is you also wrote a book, a collection of Christian ghost stories. So tell us about your writing. What was your first book, and how did you get into it? And tell us a little bit about Christian ghost stories in your latest book in this final segment here.
Most of my books have been books of either biblical exegesis. I wrote a commentary on the Epistle of James, and I wrote a book on the Sermon on the Mount. And my first book was a series of essays on skepticism, melancholy, friendship, and God. And on what could loosely again be called spirituality, although I'm a little too loosey-goosey for me, but you can call it that. And then another book on about imagery in the Gospel of John, which is a little bit more scholarly. And then this most recent book is I wrote a novel, the one that was hated by some Catholics, but it was not meant to be an anti-Catholic screed or anything. It was just satire. And this most recent book, which I consider actually one of my better books, is on the four Gospels. It's an overview of all four of the Gospels, and showing where you can find the keys of how to interpret each of those Gospels. If you know anything about the chiastic structure of Scripture, that at the very center of a Gospel, you will find the more or less the key that gives you the way of understanding the entire gospel. A little bit different when you talk about Luke and Acts, but that's what you have to go for. And so that's what that's about, with some appendices. One about the Gospel of Thomas, for example, which I think is a monastic writing of the 4th century and not an early church writing. And so anyway.
Yeah, allow me to penetrate a little bit into that with the book of Matthew, because I've been spending a lot of time in Matthew recently, and I've made some observations which may or may not be accurate. What would you say is the chiastic part of the book of Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew?
Well, Matthew is a book of that basically has 5 discourses in it and all 5 of them have to do with the church and salvation. The first is the Sermon on the Mount. After that, you then have the missionary chapter 10, where he's telling the disciples to go out and how to do that. Third one is the center of the gospel, and that is the parables of chapter 13. And at the very heart of that gospel is the parable of the sower. So that gives you an idea of what Matthew's doing. The next one's over in chapter 18, which is about church discipline, basically. How does the community discipline itself and its members? And the last one are the parables basically where he talks about the coming judgment on Jerusalem, his second coming and the judgment, and it ends with the parable of judgment, where the sheep and the goats, and what you did for me or didn't do for me, or for others you did to me, and all that. So those are your 5 discourses. They are, in a sense, the second law. You have 5 books of Moses, now you have 5 discourses of Christ. And so if you're to say, what is Matthew really, it was always called the ecclesiastical gospel, because it's very much centered on how does the church live its life, from the beginning, if you will. That is, how to live your life. So that's Matthew 5, 6, and 7, the Sermon on the Mount. where Jesus tells you very clearly, this is what I want my community to look like. In chapter 6, these are the things you're to practice, which are basically prayer, fasting, and alms giving. Chapter 7, not to judge, and then this is what you're going to be judged on, and then that's picked up again in the very last discourse.
Well, and it's that thread of judgment that I've focused on, because let me just throw out 3 data points. Judge not, right? Judge righteous judgment. Don't judge. And who are you to judge another man's servant, right? And then whatever standard of judgment you use, that's how you'll be judged. And then what was fascinating to me, and I actually gave a sermon on this in Estonia when I was invited back. I had been the first pastor of our denomination in that, under the Iron Curtain years, we were a relatively modern phenomenon. You'd probably, very much dismiss the group I was part of, but whatever. And that's fine, because I'm not part of that anymore. But I was in Estonia. I gave a sermon on the sheep and the goats, because what fascinated me was the fact of how similar they were. And there's a similarity too with the 10 virgins, because the 10 virgins all slept. Now you had the oil, right, as another, dimension of that parable, but they were all sleeping. And what struck me is, similarly, none of the sheep or goats recognized Jesus, right? Yeah. The goats didn't give the water, the sheep did, but when this was brought to their attention, they both said, "When did we see you?" And so I asked the question, why? And this was a deeply personal question for all of us. How can we be a sheep versus a goat? What's the difference here? What's the ingredient? And one of the conclusions I drew was that the sheep were not making a distinction. They weren't looking for Jesus in that sense. They weren't seeking to judge who was in and who was out. The goats, on the other hand, would have gladly served Jesus. They didn't find him. They didn't see him. Nor did the sheep, but it didn't matter to the sheep. Yeah,
it's interesting.
So to conclude my little, proposition or hypothesis here is that the key issue there is hypocrisy. And when the judgment comes, the standard of judgment that we've been using is how we'll be judged. We won't be judged on, did you keep the 4th commandment or the 6th commandment or the 9th commandment? We will be judged by our own words versus our deeds. You claimed to be about this, and you also judged other people on that standard. But let me hold this mirror up now to you. And what do you have to say about that?
Yeah, and what's interesting is what is being said by Jesus, if we really pay attention, is that when you see these people who are disadvantaged in various ways, they're hungry or they're thirsty or they're naked,
in jail, they're sick,
right. It doesn't matter who they are. It doesn't matter what you think of their,
or why they're in those circumstances.
You can't say, "Oh, well, this is a person who deserves what they get." In other words, all judgment has to be suspended by the person, and all you're doing is ministering to them. And whether it's what Mother Teresa of Calcutta used to say, is Christ in his distressing disguise. And Jesus is saying, regardless, what you missed is that because I became incarnate, we can use that theological language. I became one with the human race. Therefore, in a sense, my participation with all of these various individual lives is a very real one. And if you miss me in those lives, then you're going to miss me entirely. And that's what the judgment is based on. And as what you did to them, you did to me. And, so.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry for that diversion. So all these books, and I'm really intrigued by that latest one. I'm going to get myself a copy of Four Gospels, Four Hearts, One Lord,
yeah.
And look at that.
And then you
So,
mentioned the ghost stories. I thought,
yeah, exactly. We got to cover that, because that was one of the hooks that got me wanting to talk to you.
the ghost stories. There's 11 of them. It was my 11th book, and so I thought I'm going to stop with 11 ghost stories. Well, I'll remember in what order it came. When I become senile and at the age of 97.
That in itself is kind of haunting.
But it's these are all of them take place in the early 1960s. All of them take place in the small town in Maryland where I grew up.
Oh, wow.
It's like one of the most haunted towns in America. Everybody had a ghost. We had one across the street that became a famous haunted location. And I made these stories up, and all of them they have a psychological and spiritual aspect to them. So it's the idea that you encounter unexpectedly something that in each one that puts the protagonist, whichever, whether he's a good, bad, or indifferent individual, in a position of having to respond to something breaking into the reality that they think they understand, and that's what each story basically is. Some of them have some humor in them, and some of them are quite grim, and some are I hope challenging. And not every one is like explicitly Christian, but there's certainly an approach to it. Some are. There's some stories of quote unquote conversion, if you want, in there, but some of them are just simply meant to be very haunting and give you chills, and at the same time give you a worldview where the supernatural is always just a millionth of an inch away from the natural. So
there's horror movies, right? Like The Exorcist, that have obvious religious overtones. You have the Bible telling stories of demon possession and people being freed from that. So are these more towards the horror? Are they more towards the contemplative? And what is Christian about them?
Like I say, it's the worldview, and that is that there is a supernatural, unseen realm with which we have to do, and there's all kinds of what would you call it? All kinds of entities that show up in my stories. They might be angels, they might be revenants, they might be sort of demonic figures, or just obviously the ghosts of the departed in some sense. And so you have all of those, and all of those are just absolutely implicit in the Christian folklore, if you will,
Right.
of Europe and America, and probably globally. I can't think of any place where these don't exist. I do not dwell on the horror because I'm very much a disciple of writers like M.R. James and Arthur Machen and people like that, which the more explicit and violent it is. Now there is one or two incidents in there in the stories. It has to be there.
Right.
But the more you dwell on that, you detract from the psychological element.
Right.
Which
so we all know the movie Jaws, and it popularized that, right? Where it's the music and the threat. You hardly ever see the shark at all. He only makes a couple of brief appearances, right?
And so that's what I try to, and they're very character based. So what I do in those stories is create characters and their psyches, and how these unexpected and frankly, and they build up increasingly overwhelming and surprising experiences, and how that basically transforms them, or in some cases ends their existence. So it's
I've been into music my whole life, and some obscure bands, some popular ones. I don't know if you know who the Talking Heads were David Byrne, but now I have going through my mind the lyric, "I can feel my lifetime piling up."
Yeah. I remember the Talking Heads quite well.
Yeah. So
Anyway,
Addison,
if you're going to say what are my two favorite books, it would be the one I just had published on the Gospels and my ghost stories, which was the one right before it. And if you read the two of them back to back, you might not guess that it was written by the same person.
well, Addison, it's just been a fascinating hour getting to know you here, and I'm so grateful to have connected and your willingness to come on my show. I do hope this will be the first of multiple appearances downstream. We're also working on some ideas of some summits and some panels, which I'll invite you to participate in over the course of 2026. We're working on some interesting ideas to make the deep richness of the spiritual, to use that term, the religious messages more accessible, to diffuse the fragrance, if you will. Whether it's 1 part per million, or maybe it feels like the woman who's a little bit older, who has lost a little bit of her sense of smell, who douses herself with perfume as she gets on the elevator with you. Whether it's to whatever degree we're diffusing the fragrance of the gospel message, of the truth of God, and that Jesus came to reveal the Father and who and what he is. This show is seeking to invite people from all walks of life to get more engaged with the Word of God.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to thank you for helping us explore areas of my ignorance and hopefully of interest to the audience. What would you like to share with the audience as we wrap this up for today? What would you like to leave them with?
That's a good question. Well, I would just mention I do a Substack, and if you look up The Pragmatic Mystic, you will find my Substack. And if you're curious about what I write, that might be a place to take a look and see if it's interesting to you. And also,
I will be subscribing right after this.
And, look me up on Amazon and see what you might want to try. And I recommend my ghost stories as number one. So
as a starting point. Well, Addison, truly a pleasure. I have but one thing to do, and that is to let everybody know, remember, you're created in the image of God, and God loves his creation. And stay tuned for the sneak peek about next week's guest. And Addison, thank you so much. I will extend you an invitation to come back, and hopefully that will be soon. Till everyone else, we'll see you next week.
Thanks, Wade.
They said information would set us free. But what if it became our leash? In an age where media, power, and profit shape the very truth we see, Murtash Olson invites us to look deeper, to question the systems that trade freedom for control, and to remember that discernment is sacred. Freedom for sale, at Created in the Image of God.